All right, men, front and center, this is the official podcast of the Center for Syncretic Studies. I'm Tim Kirby, and as always, with me is the epicenter of the center, Joaquin Flores. How you doing there today?
Hey, how you doing? I'm doing good.
Today's topic is toxic masculinity, a term that a lot of people throw around all over the internet recently, and we're going to break that down. In fact, we've got some big questions. So what do these people mean when they say toxic masculinity? Is there actually a type of toxic masculinity? Is there toxic femininity? Is there a crisis of masculinity? Is it harmful to have stereotypical gender roles in society? Why is manhood a status that can be given or taken away? And can women themselves understand masculinity? Those are our big points for today. But anyways, we should probably start out with a nice definition. Joaquin, I think you found a very good, standard, strange definition for what is this so-called toxic masculinity.
Yeah, so thanks to the pop culture detective, who's a relatively popular, I would say, SJW vlogger on YouTube. He has a definition of toxic masculinity that he works from. And I had a real problem. I could identify with some of the things he was saying, but overall it was totally subjective and moralistic in a confused way. And this was, he has it as basically, I think, 7 points. And they're emotional detachment, hypercompetitiveness, aggression, intimidation, violence, sexual objectification, sexually predatory. Now, I think all of those things can have a downside. I mean, some of them are outright have negative connotations or mean negative things. But it's how you define them, or how he defines them, or how I would say in general this milieu is defining them, that becomes highly problematic and really subjective. And what I want to say is that, for example, all of these things can be connected to actual crimes. So there's like laws and books and codes in different countries, and all of these things actually can be connected to crimes. But those are like cases that involve particular instances. So like they would have to be connected to things that you can quantify. So for these things to be rather qualified, not completely subjectively, they have to be attached to real things. So you can't, I think for those reasons, the list becomes kind of useless because, for example, I mean, we'll go through the list, but all of them end up being very, very subjective.
Vague. Yeah, subjective and vague.
And vague. And they can basically be used to like gaslight anyone. Like, oh, you're being too aggressive. And you're like, what do you mean? I'm just giving my opinion. No. You're being, that's actually predatory. Like, what? So, they're just like words that can be thrown around. And when looking at, and I did a little bit of research, and the first one is emotional detachment. And I was like, well, that's not a crime anywhere. And then I actually remembered that it is a crime in marriages. It's considered a form of spousal abuse in some countries, that it's actually considered on par with wife beating to be emotionally detached. And
oh, well, that's where are you talking about, Scandinavia or something? Because that's that's
actually in England too now.
Ridiculous.
I believe in England.
Yeah. Oh, I see. Well, that's another thing. Try to prove that in a court of law. Although I guess some people do.
Well, they do, and that's the problem, and that's the problem that we're heading towards, is the legislation of these things.
Well, basically, if you can establish that these things are bad overall in society, then eventually legislation is going to match it. But I mean, if we go through this, we take a look at it. Emotional detachment is being toxic. Then every doctor on the entire planet is very toxic, because a lot of people who have very stressful or dangerous professions, they have to be emotionally detached. I mean, doctors see people die every day, sometimes at their own hands, by sometimes their own fault or not their own fault. Soldiers, the police, a lot of the stereotypically male professions all require you to be emotionally detached, and maybe that's why they're filled with men. I don't know.
That's a very good point. I consider emotional detachment to have a negative connotation. Like, for example, a father who's emotionally detached to his children is like, that's a criticism that his children, like, later in life will like levy at him. Oh, he was emotionally detached. But oftentimes those same fathers were working in difficult, the reality is that for the vast, 99% plus of human history, up until recently in the so-called developed world, like work was mostly physical manual labor for the vast majority of people, and it wasn't fun work. And men and women had to learn a degree of emotional detachment. And I'm not saying that's a good thing, but it's a survival thing. And
it's just the way humanity had to live.
It's the way
like
that
it or not, you got to go out there and get that cabbage.
Yes, and to use that
Literally.
against people, in other words, like to use a condition that people developed or acquired, or that were, let's say even evolutionarily, let's say predisposed to develop under certain conditions, to use that against people, to like shame them, or to like now try to go and correct that, or to convict all of history based upon conditions that exist today that weren't in play then, is like the peak of gaslighting a population. And it seems like another mechanism of social control.
Well, yeah, it's basically, in a lot of ways, what the sort of SJW movement is, they sort of want to criminalize or punish every aspect of humanity that's evolved over the millennia. You know what I mean? I think they see things as, again, as the whole world as being social constructs, as in the way we are is just based on the way that propaganda makes it to be, not based on any sort of actual history or genetics or otherwise, so, or hormones for that matter. But I can tell you one thing is that I would actually say that if you are not emotionally detached, you can't be rational. Because rational thinking forces you to step back from your emotions, put them aside, and be like, okay, maybe this bad thing happened in my life, but maybe I'm a tiny minority. I need to think about this and have political opinions based on reason and facts and so on. And if you can't put your emotions aside, then you're essentially hysterical.
Right. In fact, it's almost like trying to flip the script on histrionic behavior.
Yeah.
In other words, like emotional detachment, I can see where it's a problem, and then I can see where, like my fundamental premise that I'm operating from, and this is probably the root of the issue, is that I don't think that most gender expression at the fundamental level is socially constructed, right? So I think that 99.999% of the time there is a direct correlation between gender and sex, and we can look around the world at we can try to do history, or like history in cultural anthropology, although that's flawed, but we can try to do history and look at cultures in the past, although invariably we're viewing them through the prism of the present. But we can look at contemporary societies around the world, and we can look at sex or gender divisions in labor. We can look at sex and gender differences in behaviors, and we can begin to distill those things which are universal, and thereby start to subtract those things which are socially constructed. But but I wouldn't even say that social construction is avoidable or can even be reconstructed if the fundamental basis of society is not different. So in other words, just because something is socially constructed doesn't mean that it's irrational or doesn't fit or can be undone. Because human beings have been in this process of what is called biocultural evolution for millennia. So it's kind of missing the point to try to separate social construction from human activity and from the essence of being a human being. What I mean by this is this: like, there's no doubt that that birds make nests, but now those nests are physically constructed things that they make, like intentionally with their beaks, right? And they build these nests. But is nest building? I mean, it's not a biological component of the being that you can observe, like on the bird. Like there's making a nest.
Oh it wasn't born with blueprints in the egg with it. Yeah.
Right. I mean, but that doesn't mean that it's. But does that mean that the nest is socially constructed, or are birds biologically predetermined to build nests? Like if
interesting.
You see what I'm saying? Like if
I never thought about it that way. Huh.
You see, like I would propose that if a bird didn't grow up around other birds and it didn't observe a nest being built, that it would still build those nests. And I think that, I think that you can take animals in captivity that didn't, like in a zoo, that didn't grow up with other animals of that type in nature, and they would still display most of the gender dimorphism in practice that we see in nature.
Joaquin has one big problem. We got to talk about this a little bit later, but one big problem is people aren't having children because it does change your perspective. And once you have kids, a lot of this stuff that these kind of people are talking about on the internet, these SJW types, it flies right out the window when you see it with your own eyes.
Yeah, you know? and the thing is that's interesting is that school teachers, like elementary school teachers, like observe this the most. So in my life and talking to people, that it's like actually elementary school teachers that are, I mean, they're being confronted with being told like, well, don't encourage these things, and they're like, yo, like I'm not encouraging these things. Like if it's socially constructed,
it's just happening. It's happening in front of my eyes, you know, one way or the other.
It's like the boys don't want to play with dolls. They just don't. Yeah. I mean, maybe like the one gay kid does, but you know, in a class of 30, maybe there's like 5 of them now. But I mean, but that's it.
But,
and that's fine. You know, there's nothing criminal about that. You see, that's the problem, is that the issue's been totally polarized. I mean, they're trying to make you become a phobic or a philiac in either direction, instead of just accepting like people how they are and not saying that this is preferable. It's just saying it's. So what they've done is they've taken the way that there was like a very good moment like a number of decades ago in the West, where I think that a lot of the generation of people who are actually probably no longer alive now, they had a lot of prejudices about things like, let's say whether it's homophobia or sexism, like misogyny. I don't even like the term because it's not really hatred of women, but let's say that like sexism against women's ability to do things like competently, that I don't even encounter that in the world anymore. I'm like a middle-aged guy, and I remember like the movement was already like 30 years old when I was in my teens to like overcome this, and it kept getting promoted, and I think it was successful, and I'm not against that it was promoted so heavily, but now it seems like the goals have been accomplished, but the organizations and the bureaucracies that develop to combat this like still have their funding sources, and they still have their machines, and they can't like deconstruct their machines. It reminds me a lot of the American military industrial complex after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Like they built this thing up.
It's just going to keep going, whether it needs to exist or not.
Right. And it's like, whoa, wait a minute. It's like I remember when I was a kid in the early 90s, like I was in the vanguard of like, you know, in my high school campus, like I used to wear like an ACT UP t-shirt that said like, you know, it was basically combating homophobia. And now I'm being like placed in this camp where like people are trying to, you know, tag me as like a homophobic or a sexist, when this is actually they've reinvented what these terms mean. So they're actually now it's really Orwellian. I mean, it's actually on crazy batshit level, because they're the ones that are redefining what these words have always meant.
But I just want to say, let me just attack this first, because usually if you have the preface hyper, that means it's too much. So even if someone was hyper happy or hyper sad or hyper anything, it would be bad. So that's kind of a weird thing to state. So that means that I guess normal competitiveness or a somewhat competitive nature in men is good. I doubt the person in this video, that whatever detective guy, I doubt he actually believes in that. He probably feels competitiveness is very harmful to us all.
This is all about pathologizing human behavior, and so what's interesting to me is that what happened in the left, what happened in the left 50 years ago now is that a type of anarchism and let's say new leftism. Well, if I'm not mistaken, it was in Europe, the new left was associated with Maoism, but it wasn't the Maoism of China. It was like how anarcho-communists and leftists in Western Europe were like interpreting Maoism through their lens as like first world Europeans, which had like almost nothing to do with how the Chinese Cultural Revolution was being done in China.
Yeah, it's like now all the people in the West are doing yoga and stuff, and they're interested in Hindu, but whatever they're doing is nothing related to the Hindu going on in India.
That's the same exact. So, yeah. Actually, that's a really good analogy, because there's actually a lot of I would almost like forgive the use of the term. I don't mean it in the sense it's normally meant, but a type of Orientalism of like projecting or exoticness of like projecting something onto an Eastern people that's actually not in that people or isn't relevant at all. The main idea is that in the United States, the New Left grew up out of not Maoism, although Maoism was kind of connected to it, but that really took off in Berkeley. And it didn't really take off until the 80s with the group called MIM, the Maoist International Movement. But I'm not saying this is like a communist conspiracy. It has like nothing to do with any event in China. It's just that like communism as a social movement was catching on, and then there's been attempts by the establishment to derail it and redefine it. And I'm not saying that the original thing could, I'm not saying that Maoism in its true form could like work in the United States, but what I'm saying is that like Mao and the Chinese have like nothing to do with the New Left, and
it's like when they make those crappy movies in Hollywood, loosely based on a true story.
Loosely based on a true story, right? and so, but it was in this attempt to redefine the left and to get to, they were chiefly concerned with, well, they claimed to be chiefly concerned with the authoritarianism of the left, and that it was too much like the right. And so in Germany, what they did in Germany, for example, and this is like almost like patient zero, because it really started in Germany right after World War II, is that instead of like looking at questions of like capitalism and imperialism as being the root cause of Nazism, let's say, and I'm not saying that is, I'm just saying instead of looking at it through that lens, which would have been a place to start, let's say, they decided that it was masculinity that was the essence of Nazism, that toxic masculinity was the essence of fascism and Nazism, and that it was masculinity that led to hyper-competitiveness, capitalism, imperialism, war, chauvinism, racism, that these were like fundamentally masculine things, that women in their true nature, like not the woman that's being constructed under conditions of misogyny or sexism where they don't have agency, but like the true female essence is like fundamentally anti-racist, anti-capitalist. Does that make sense? So that they were trying to say that if we put women in charge, then we're going to get to socialism without having this kind of semi-fascist Stalinism, which is hyper-masculine.
Well, I think that kind of maybe ties into the next component of their toxic masculinity list, which is aggression. That, if you sort of look at it and you look at, okay, who are the big movers and shakers of capitalism, the Industrial Revolution, the military-industrial complex, war, are all men. But would things somehow work out to some sort of utopia if men weren't in those positions? I'm not so sure. I think that there's a certain degree where competitiveness and aggression sort of drives scientific developments and also economic developments. So I think without that, it would sort of be like those weird matriarchal tribes that exist somewhere in like the forests between the Amazon, but also I think between like Bangladesh and India there are some. And I mean, so why exactly have these tribes not grown up to forge great nations? Because it's not a good system when you have one woman with 6 husbands and she has like 2 kids.
The thing that's very interesting about these experiments is that or anthropological studies is that what's interesting is that if you study anthropology, there's something called the sociological imagination, and C. Wright Mills talks about this, and he's really probably in the West, and that was the book I was trying to find on my shelf. Was I have in a preface he has a letter to the left, and he calls for the creation of a new left. And he wants to, and he makes a lot of good points that I agree with. In fact, there are some ideas in the New Left that I do agree with, and they have a lot to do in a funny way with the development of what became known as the New Age movement and then the self-help and self-improvement movement. And I think that these are actually fundamentally, usable movements that have something positive to say, because it really gets to the question of, like, if you're trying to create a better society, don't we have to also try to make ourselves better people to build that society? And then, the standard typical historical Marxist argument against that is that the weight and the construct of the present class society is so overpowering that you cannot actually create better people in this society, and it's therefore a reactionary or petty bourgeois or idealist idea that you can improve people in the present to help build a better future. Now, I disagree with that basic Marxist idea, but here's my point: but Tim, but here's the point. Yeah. And forgive me for belaboring it, but the point is that the new left is not fundamentally wrong, that we have to examine our own behaviors and that part of the, at least for leadership in a society that's trying to build a better society, does have to examine their own proclivities and actions and treatment of other people. The problem is in how they have defined the problems and how that's been hijacked to actually work against social change in the right direction. Does that make any sense? So,
actually, this time you're losing me here, man.
Okay, look, it's very simple. The basic idea that people like C. Wright Mills and others proposed to the left is that people in a society have to look at changing their own behaviors and their own attitudes.
Well, yeah, you've got to change yourself before you can change others. I mean, that's a bumper sticker statement, yeah.
So take that. Now, that's not a Marxist idea. The Marxist idea is that the superstructure, the base of society of capitalism, is so overpowering and so influential on society, on culture, on the superstructure, that it's futile, idealist, and therefore
that you're basically crushed by default.
Yes. And I disagree with
that. I got. Yeah.
So in a sense, the new left was onto something correct when they began to rub elbows or touch on the edge of what became the self-help and self-improvement movement that emerged out of the same period, you see.
Yeah.
Okay, but what I'm saying is that it got derailed. Now here's the final point.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, that it got derailed and it went in the wrong direction. That's my point.
Mm-hmm. Oh, well, yeah, because the self-help movement is generally full of people who are totally helpless and want to be told what to do. That's a big part of the problem.
Yeah, but that's like the SJW thing too.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I don't know about that. They seem, I wouldn't say that, because self-help is generally like, I don't know what to do. I'm going to go to some training seminar and pay $50 to feel like I've made progress in my life.
Like the Anthony Robbins thing, right?
The whole SJW thing is not so much a replacement for church. Church that's very expensive, by the way. It's more sort of like wanting to be able to feel self-righteous. It's sort of like picking away at elements of Christianity to make yourself feel superior to others. Kind of. I'm explaining this.
No, you're making sense. Go on.
But I'm just. Yeah, it's more like this ability to feel good about yourself and feel righteous by some sort of maybe self-flagellation or
but it's also flagellating others.
Yeah, it's sort of like this sort of race to the bottom, like who can show that they're the most martyrish in terms of the way they're being without actually really doing anything. Because one of the key components of the whole SJW thing is not actually accomplishing anything. That's very important.
So
things are very emotional.
I think we're on the same page, but what I would piggyback on that is to say is that like you're making complete sense about the self-flagellation, but what has become even more toxic, if we can say toxic, has been how it's used to flagellate others to make themselves feel like, in other words, it's almost like I remember like in the 90s and the 80s, Buddhism and Hinduism were very, very popular in California, as they had been since like the 70s. So it was continuing forward. And this was like right before like the coffee house, like Starbucks franchise explosion. And so these types of people like already existed before Starbucks. And they were already virtue signaling this stuff about like destruction of the ego, or karma and all this kind of like semi-Zen Buddhist or ideas from like Hare Krishna stuff, or or the Dalai Lama, like Lama Buddhism. So like these. And what's interesting is that all these ideas about humility exist in Christianity, but I think Christianity had lost a lot of legitimacy among urban dwellers for a lot of complex reasons we won't get into. But they basically found the same ideas, and like a lot of the hypocrisy that turned people off from Christianity, like just kind of re-emerged and reinvented itself, both in self-help, in SJWs, and in like Western Buddhism.
Well, yeah, it's sort of like how a lot of the great religions of the world share a lot of things in common. And essentially, I think what happened with a lot of these people in California, like you mentioned, it's sort of like they see their own religion, their native religion, as bad. It's the typical liberal, I hate my own culture, but they still need the things from said religion. So they see it in another religion and say, oh, it's good, even though a lot of it's very similar. Because, I don't know, I generally see that there's a lot of overflow between the religions, and people who are more naive don't really seem to see that.
So, like, when we look at, like, aggression, because that's what we're talking about, right? Is that
we've moved to aggression, yes.
Is that, like, with hyper competitiveness, you were basically, and we were like on the same page, that just adding the word hyper before it makes it bad. But who could really, like, competitiveness, like this is like I'm not trying to, like, look, if we look at the gentleman, promoting this view, and like it's clear that he's in the very bottom of the barrel. It's just interesting that well,
he's not morbidly obese.
Well, he's not morbidly obese, but he's like not at all fit. In other words, like in the rare moments that like women have a few glasses of wine and they're honest with each other, like when it's girl time, not when they're doing the whole like second grade schoolroom teacher routine, which is typical of class, modern society, or society in the history of civilization. I would say is that men and women have a different interpretation of the truth. And men's version of the truth is a truth that distinguishes them from other people, and it can be competitive. And men's version of the truth is one that is based in a different part of the brain, let's say, or refers to things like numbers and logic, whereas like female truth, and it's an equally valid truth, okay? But female truth is based in like, what should the outcome be? Like, does it bring people together or does it tear people apart? Or which people are the out group and which people are the in group? So, like, the argument I agree with is the argument that is part of my in group, or which brings people together, or which, like, hurts the feelings of the least number of people, or hurts the feelings of the person that's in the out group, you see? And that's very different. So, in other words, like, 2 + 2 can equal 3 if it brings us together. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Or 2 + 2
it depends on the audience too.
Yes, and 2 + 2 can equal 5 if a person we don't like is saying that it equals 4. So,
that's like that classic thing where a woman asks another woman for advice. The woman tells her everything she wants to hear. She asks her man for advice. The man tells her everything she doesn't want to hear.
Yes, but what I'm saying is that with a few glasses of wine, and if it's just like girl time alone, there's no like honest woman that's gonna like look at this gentleman, talking about this and say, I've masturbated to the thought of, intimacy with him. You see what I'm saying? Like, he's not a part of any female's fantasy. And so this is like when I was talking to my wife, like kind of getting my ideas together to talk about toxic masculinity. As you guys know, she's Serbian, and so it's like part of the post-Ottoman part of the Slavic world. So there's like a lot of Turkish, Ottoman influences, Serbian, Slavic, Russian influences in the culture. It's very interesting. But what it's not is it's not Western, right? And I asked her, like, so if I say toxic masculinity, like, what thoughts do you have? Like, what did she go? And she's like, well, I would say her first thought was like a guy who's a bad role model for young men, like giving him the wrong idea of what a man can be or should be based on his behavior, and that this was like harmful to young men, that maybe a guy that younger men might look up to was like giving a bad example of how to be a man, right?
And
and then I said, well, like, what would be an example of that? And she gave a few different examples, and some I agreed with, some I didn't. And she gave like 3 or 4 examples. But what was very interesting about her sort of intuitive way of describing what could be toxic masculinity, because she never heard of this term. I should include that she's highly educated, postgraduate education. She's a professional. She reads novels and stuff. Okay, we can talk about many complex subjects, and she educates me all the time about things, right? So we're not talking about a servile or uneducated woman here. We're just talking about the fact that it's not a society that's infected with whatever this second, third, fourth wave feminism. You see what I'm saying? So what's very interesting is that she had never heard this term. I mean, she follows vloggers and reads, columns and the paper, and right. I mean, she's plugged into our culture here in Serbia, right? Yeah. And she never heard of this term toxic masculinity. Thank God, right? So I said, like, what is that to you? And so, like I said, she went to explain it. And what was so interesting to me is that none of her definitions had anything to do with something harmful to women. So, like, all of the things that she could think of that would be toxic masculinity were harmful to men and boys.
I see. Interesting. So it's more of an internal situation.
Yes. Yeah, because the idea that women were victims of men was not even on the radar screen, you see. And I said, well, what about how women... And she goes, oh, well, women want men to be masculine. And I said, even toxically? She goes, well, maybe, yes, some. That's actually a thing that women are...
Let me jump in with what I see as a form of toxic masculinity. So remember, my background is Cleveland, majority black neighborhood, poor, right? So whether you're black or white or Hindu, the third sort of minority there, generally a lot of people didn't have fathers, okay, regardless of their race. And you see that when these guys are growing up in what most people would refer to as the ghetto with no dad, basically men want to be men, right? They want to grow up to be men, and they're in this constant search to find this sort of masculine ideal. But the problem is it all turns out to be just like rap music or something. So it becomes a sort of toxic example to follow of what's being a man: crime, acting tough in a very stupid way, not in a reasonable way, having cool clothes, that sort of stuff. A very superficial, primitive form of manhood. So the way I see the world, Joaquin, is my sort of theory is there's sort of these 3 statuses of men. There's the absolute bottom, which is this pop culture detective who's a non-man. Then there's this sort of toxic masculine, like rapper, jock, wannabe kind of guy who's trying to be male but is sort of missing the point. And then hopefully at the top is the more evolved, knightly, samurai-esque, philosophical man who is...
Sounds like a philosopher king.
Yeah, who's the warrior, the father, the protector, who's confident and strong and serves his society. I kind of can see that most men break down into these 3 sort of categories, and let's hope I'm near the top of that scale. You know what I mean? I can only hope that I am, but who knows, maybe I'm not. But with these people in this SJW movement, in a lot of ways, they are sort of non-men. They reject even the toxic idea of masculinity. Like I said, this I'm a criminal thug, I'm going to kick your ass kind of way of looking at the world.
Well, look, like pulling up our list here again, if you can pull it up.
I got it. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I hope viewers can see it now too. So now when you look at aggression, if you look at aggression, hypercompetitiveness, intimidation, and violence, like aren't those like 4 subjective ways that could all be used to describe like the same thing? So like if you just like let your eyes land on this list of 7, it's actually like you don't really focus on the toxic part. It's actually masculinity, and then it's basically saying stoic.
Well, yeah, being stoic is wrong, even though stoic is the very core of this more true top-tier male way of being. I mean, what man that you really respect isn't stoic?
Right.
No one.
It's right.
It's part of the deal, man.
Like I'm really trying to understand. Like in other words, like look, this is not bullying, and I'm like in other words, like this is a guy who's put himself on video and is attacking. He's I don't know where he's from or what like socioeconomic class he comes from. He could be a working class guy that's just trying to find his place in the world too. Don't get me wrong, but he's like upholding this really petty bourgeois, gynocentric perspective that's not even actually, in talking to my wife, it's not gynocentric. It's actually just this complete mythology I see it as a form of class warfare of the ruling class, or let's say the upper middle class, like let's say the petty bourgeoisie, that these are like the social values just like of that class, and they're hitting over the head with a hammer the working class dispositions. And I'm not talking about the broken working class in the decline of the family period, but just you can go back 100 years and these are just normal behaviors, and they're saying, oh, they're not normal, they've been normalized, and you're normalizing them by promoting them.
It's a very bourgeois perspective. It's the perspective of people who are very pampered. And I guess if you do live an upper middle class lifestyle, you're very removed from having to be masculine. You can function and be completely emasculated. The problem is when you're poor and you need to do things with your hands, or maybe you live in a part of the world that's a little bit, maybe not full of conflict, but full of possible danger, yeah, all of a sudden being that way is not very good for your health. You know what I mean? Just like I can even say, again, anecdotal evidence. Sorry, I'm kind of filling this podcast with a lot of anecdotal evidence, which is not very good, but accept my apologies. I know a guy who lives in the Altai Mountains, and one of the things there is he sort of had to get beat in to live in the village that he lived in. He started living there, and then two guys attacked him because he was just an outsider. He was able to beat off two guys. He took off one of the guy's fingers, by the way. And after that, he didn't have any problems. Now, that's maybe not the way people want to live, but that's some of the realities of the world. And that kind of violence, basically, I think that for the violence of the past and the way we lived in the past, it's not that far away. It's one economic crisis. It's 3 days of having the electricity turned off. We are very close to that. And so we really shouldn't fall into this pampered bourgeois trap, or we're not going to be strong enough to survive. I'm not saying become like an animal or violent. I'm just saying that there's something very alluring about the bourgeois lifestyle, but it is very, very fragile.
The reason that there's so much pushback that's been successful, like the reason that the things that we're saying are actually what most people think. And the reason that that's the case, and the reason there's been so much pushback against the sort of SJW approach to concepts of gender, masculinity, and so forth, or social construction, the reason there's so much pushback is that, and the reason I think that our anecdotes are actually quite telling and actually descriptive, is that basically these people have hijacked the social discourse, and then they're trying to tell you who you are and how to interpret these things. But it's actually important for people to reflect on their own lived experiences and go, wait a minute, that's like not at all how things work. Like when I think about society and culture and tropes and how things are explained, like when you think about like the bad kid in the classroom, you just thought of a boy, didn't you? Okay. And
yeah.
And when you think of like a goody two shoes, like that could be a boy or a girl. It is certainly like the girl sitting in the front of the class with her hands close together, like batting her eyes, like, yes, teacher, yes, teacher. And so I think that this like fundamental concept of society itself has pathologized normal, not normalized, but normal male behavior, which is not separable from gender. Like the sex of maleness is not 99.99% of the time separatable from gender. So it's like, it's casually descriptive and useful to combine these terms. Like, in other words, like a term is useful if it describes things generally so. And if it's like 70% generally so, then I can see the argument being made to like at times, make a qualification that's not all the time true. But if it's like 80, 90, 100, almost 100% true, like almost all of the time, then making these qualifications is actually like a form of thought control. Like being told that you have to continually make these qualifications, that one could make a difference between sex and gender, is actually a form of control in itself. And I think once people understand that, they'll break out of this need to, differentiate the two. And so the point that I really want to like hone in on is that when we like look at these questions, and we have to like reflect back on our own lived experiences. Like I've never seen like in other words, like if the human species survives in part in the final analysis because people can eat and then people can have intercourse and reproduce. Like I'm having a really hard time with the pop culture detectives list here. Like I'm having a really hard time like seeing how any of these, if we like take away the subjective elements, in other words, like detachment is a way of confronting danger, or right? Competitiveness or violence, intimidation, aggression, that's all the fucking same. And then sex. Like kick out the terms toxic, kick out the term hyper, kick out the term objectification or predatory.
Well, yeah. So it's basically what he's arguing is be a virgin, be passive, and be emotional.
Yeah, be emotional.
Don't control your emotions.
Yeah, don't control your emotions. Don't try to eat if someone else is trying to eat. Like that's what competitiveness. Like we live in like the. I'll explain where I'm coming from philosophically or actually sociologically in just a second. So if we kick out all of those subjective terms, this guy has a problem, and what these misandrist, neo-feminist, whatever are trying to do is they're living in a bubble, and I'm gonna explain what that bubble is and why it exists in just a moment, if you'll let me. But what I want to say is that like violence or competitiveness, because actually it's like competitiveness to what point? Well, if you're willing to take it to the point that you win, someone can say you're being aggressive or defensive or intimidating or not sensitive to your intimidation of others. I mean, it's crazy. It's gaslighting. Let's face it. So it's basically sex, competitiveness, and emotional control is how people have been able to eat, defend themselves from predators, and have children in time.
It's a core part of the reason we exist today.
The reason that we exist today.
It's a core part of our survival as a species.
Right.
So let's erode that
yeah,
core
let's get rid of that.
Yeah, let's erode that.
Yeah. So maybe this is like, I mean, the Chinese have a policy had for a long time, like a one-child policy, and that was effective in stemming population growth in China, let's say, right? But it seems that instead of just having a system in the West of saying like, look, if you have your first kid, he's going to get free healthcare and free education and a guaranteed job that is meaningful if he has the merits to earn that. Okay, instead of doing that, they're trying to like reduce the population like in other ways. Like, I mean, I'm just speculating and kind of half jokingly
destroying our ability to produce children, rather than just giving us a limit or something.
And I also want to point out, like in terms of actually epistemologically, in terms of like a theory of knowledge or describing the world, these concepts are really flawed, like critically flawed. Like in other words, the concept of or the term sexual objectification is actually an incoherent, like non-starter, like logically.
Well, yeah, I've never even really understood what they mean by that.
Because you see, the thing is that human beings are subjects, but they also exist physically in the world. And objectification, like in other words, like look, for example, when a species are doing when it's mating season. And species or when the female is in estrus and she's like sending off signals, like these are signals of health and these are signals of viability to reproduce. And men or the male also has to produce. In birds, the men are more like peacocks, I guess, and they're like have the more colors in avian species, but in other species it works differently. Whatever. I mean, every species has like their way of doing it, but what is the same in every species, at least, among vertebrae or let's say among mammalian species, is that the animals sniff each other out. Like, are they putting off like healthy pheromones? Among more evolved, like among species, like
well, there are some sort of standards of sexual beauty or sexual
yes, they have to do with like
and that
symmetry.
The ones that have
strength.
And the ones that have more are more desirable,
Yes.
and the ones that have less are less desirable.
Yes, like
We definitely see
a
that in
shiny
human
coat
beings.
is better. A shiny coat is better than like a dull coat, whether it means that
Yeah.
you're clean or have good hormones or you're getting enough like healthy lipids in your diet. If you're getting enough healthy lipids in your diet, you're probably going to be able to produce those for children or catch those. And it's so fucking obvious what the signs of sexual health refer to, that when men and women, refer to them in the world in looking at a potential partner, that's what's being called objectification. So they're trying to tell you that beauty is a social construct when it's not. Like, in other words, are there elements of beauty that are different from culture to culture? Yes, there are. In other words, like, you can separate beauty between those things which are like biologically predetermined as the framing urge or the framing of beauty.
But everywhere there is some sort of beautiful versus ugly. Everywhere.
And there are no cultures that in history or parallel around the world, even like in some tribe in the Amazon, right, where that ugliness is the virtue of sexual reproduction. Like, maybe there's like a myth about an ugly person who was wise, or an ugly person who was noble, or an ugly person who saved the day, or was the smartest, or whatever. Like, every culture has a place for ugly people that's constructive and healthy, and that's good. Every culture practically does. But there are no cultures that say that ugliness is a reproductive strength.
I actually recently had a discussion with some Russian women. I asked them, okay, so what do you think makes a woman a real woman? And their answer almost universally was childbirth and raising children. That's what makes you a woman. And there's something that makes you a man, and I think it's more abstract, and people like this gentleman, they seem to reject it, and that annoys me. So I kind of wanted to say, in closing to our conversation, because we're over the hour mark here, is sort of like, what are these criteria to be a man, and why does it bother me so much when men reject this?
Yeah, my closing comment would be an answer to that question, is that the reason that it bothers you is that none of us are saying that there can't be men like that or there shouldn't be men like that, because historically there are men like that. But there's two things going on. The first is that they're telling us how to be and how not to be. And maybe there's a reaction to some of that kind of like, Uncle Pete the Sailor or whatever. Oh, man up, whatever. There's an old school kind of guy way of being like, oh, he's a bit soft, he needs to man up, he's not going to survive in the world. I mean, there's definitely that maybe these kind of guys are reacting to, but that's a real thing. I can see that. But I think that it's because they're trying to pathologize normal, and even though, most people should try to be a little bit sensitive to abnormal and should try to be tolerant of the outliers, that's completely different from those outliers turning around and saying, no, we're the normal and we're the right, and the majority of you all guys who in a class society are also working class are the problem. And that's why it gets weaponized by the ruling class. That's why it's a form of class warfare, this like so-called SJW stuff or this neo-feminism stuff. It's actually very petty bourgeois. It irks you because it's anti-popular, it's anti-human, it goes against your lived experiences, it goes against your biology, it goes against what you've seen has worked in human civilization despite all of its flaws, because it's the better option between what they're presenting, you see. So I think that's how you're probably instinctively getting it, and that's putting words to that, I would say. So my closing comment would be that in general, there's no problem with this guy being how he is. I think that there's a problem with toxins and plastics and GMO and hormone, things that are hormone blockers or hormone enablers that are toxins and plastics and in our foods and environment and in pesticides that have led towards this trend where people are, I think, quite normally even, or quite not normally, I want to say by default, they're just engaged in a new type of gender expression, which is based upon much lower testosterone levels. So I don't tend to think that these are like men with bad ideas, like the gentleman in the video. Like, I don't think that he decided to be this way. I think that this is like his like,
you're kind of going with the soy boy theory. basically.
Yeah.
That there
That's
are
where I'm
certain
going
things
with,
that are
yeah.
reducing testosterone levels en masse in society, and it's a reflection of that.
Yeah, it's a reflection.
And so my closing thoughts. What can I really say about this? All I can say is that rejecting the very ideas and like you were just saying, Joaquin, about how basically the model, be it flawed, that's worked for humanity for so long, just boldly rejecting that is nuts, and oppressing the overwhelming majority to sort of suit the feelings of some minority is really ridiculous. And I think that already, we talked way about this earlier, but this sort of old school 1800s mentality of like, no woman could ever be a scientist, that's dead. That's absolutely done. And so, no one now in our generation, well, maybe there's someone, but in our generation now, no one is thinking a woman can't be a scientist, so just lay off. The feminists achieved that first goal of the silly thing of women can't go to college or basically all that. It's done, it's over. But just back off with this stuff. It's not, you forcing me to try to be feminine is not going to work because I can't. And the majority of men can't. It's not in the cards. It's not in the cards. Back off. Because we're tougher than you.
You're a criminal, you're going to go to jail. You're going to go to jail,
apparently,
bro.
one day.
You're going to jail.
All right, but anyways, man, that was a Front and Center, the podcast, the official podcast of the Center for Syncretic Studies. I'm Tim Kirby. With me was Joaquin Flores, as always. Dismissed.